have 20 minutes?
Yes, 20 minutes and then 5 minutes for questions at the end.
Great. Okay. All right. So I will get started. Again, thank you to Alexandra and your amazing team for putting together this event. I know you guys, how much work you put into this, and you are very attentive with all the needs of all the speakers and so forth, and making sure that we're here and prepared. So thank you very much, and for the opportunity. I apologize I was not able to come earlier to listen to all the talk, but I was very pleased to be able to hear the team before me that put together this very thoughtful and comprehensive understanding of the relationship between feminism and open science and the kind of power dynamics that we need to be paying attention to. So it is a very good segue into what I actually have to share as well. And I will build on some of those points that were raised by Madeline and her team. And also at the same time, I like to push them to think about some of the things that they may not have thought about sufficiently, and hopefully we can have a dialogue about those differences as well. So the title of my talk is just referencing really the key message I want to convey today, which is what open science should be for and with whom. I have a brief agenda that I'm putting together. Hopefully I can get through this. If not, I'll give you the punchline first, so that if I don't get to the end, at least you hear my main message. And so I will start off with a little bit about who I am, where I'm coming from, and I think my biases is important to stay upfront, and my particular point of view. And of course, like the team before me, who acknowledges a lot of influence from mentors, from philosophers, and from all the different researchers before them. Of course, the work that I do is built on many people's work, and some of their names will be erased, but I will forget many of them. But it's taken for granted that the work that I'm sharing is really built on the works of many people from around the world. One of the key points I want to make is that a lot of the discourse about open science, open research, open scholarship tends to be focused on technicalities and a lot of things about standards, even though they are not stated as such. In fact, I think in the previous talk, there were a lot of references to things like replication, reproducibility, data sharing, about being as open as possible and as close as necessary. Those that are kind of to me are technicalities and standards that are becoming kind of common language in a way, but I would also like to call attention to them that they need to be also interrogated, because there are a lot of assumptions built into them, not the least of which is a lot of assumptions about Western science itself. The notion of reproducibility, very much central to Western science, that needs to be interrogated. And so in that regard, I don't think we're paying enough attention to the political economy of how knowledge is constructed and shared and disseminated. And again, who has the power to decide what these criteria are, what constitute legitimate way of looking and sharing knowledge, and whose knowledge is being shared in the first place. These are issues about power and politics, and we need to pay more attention to them. And the way when we look at power and politics is that often it is embedded in the infrastructures and the governance of the system on which we rely upon on a daily basis, but we seldom see them because infrastructures are largely invisible to us. And we need to be thinking about who are in controls of the infrastructure, and infrastructures are things that not simply are the physical or material infrastructure, but there are also a lot of intangible things such as standards and principles and criteria that are embedded into the technology, but often are made invisible. But those people who design the technology and who decide what get embedded into the codes are the one that will then create the kind of spaces that make certain kind of things possible and make a lot of other things impossible. So I want to talk a little bit more about how infrastructure can enable kind of collaborative, open collaboration that is inclusive, but at the same time, we need to be careful about how some of the existing infrastructure already foreclose possibilities in terms of who can participate and who are excluded in the first place. So my own biases, I teach at the University of Toronto in the Center for Critical Development Studies, and this is a development studies unit that our program looked broadly as global inequality, and my particular interest is looking at knowledge inequality and knowledge inequity. And in recent years, I have been more focusing on our own institutional practices. That is, instead of looking at how other people produce inequality, I think we have to look more at our own practices within the university. As researchers and then faculty member in university, we are complicit, often complicit and explicit in reproducing the kind of global inequality in knowledge production that we see today. This is just an example of many universities, my university included, that like to tout this university rankings, the global rankings, as a way to show their excellence and the worldliness, if you will. As branding is very much part of the game of university, as many of you know. But these branding exercises carry with it a set of criteria. That is, how much do you publish, how much research money do you get, how many citations do you receive, and what prestigious journals do you publish in. These are all built in, encoded into these university rankings, and universities compete against each other on these rankings. And as faculty members, we're driven to participate in the system of competition that reproduces the kind of global inequality that we see. Now, at the same time, we are also cognizant, the university, the community, Canada at large, is cognizant of the fact that universities are where they are today because of the settlement they are able to have on Indigenous land. The land on which my university sits historically belongs to the people, well, but not belong, were occupied by people of the Huron-Wendat generations and generations ago, and then they were subsequently occupied by people of the Mississauga of the Credit River most recently. And so over time, different groups of peoples have come and shared this land over time until, of course, the settler comes in and declare these land theirs. And then the Indigenous people are excluded from these land, and universities and other property owners are able to build their buildings and enjoy the resources and bountifulness and extracted the wealth from these land over time. So I think it is important to remember that where we are is built on the back of a lot of other invisible history, and particularly as we engage in this form of knowledge productions of competing against each other, we're at the same time erasing and make invisible Indigenous knowledge here locally, but also all around the world. And so that's one of the key message I want to convey. And so this is one of the areas I'm interested in looking at over the years, and how knowledge productions are so fundamentally asymmetrical between the global north and the global south. And this map doesn't mean that the global south doesn't produce any knowledge. It only means that when we look at production of knowledge through the lenses of citation and impact factor, much of the world's knowledge are simply rendered invisible because those lenses simply do not see other forms of knowledge as being valuable. It's not that their knowledge don't exist. In fact, much of the knowledge around the world exists, and that we have blind to them and to our detriment. I've been involved with open access for some time. I took part in the Budapest Open Access Initiative, and in fact, next year, 2022, is going to be the 20th anniversary of the BOAI. And so I will reflect a little bit on what I thought I knew then and how much I think I don't know now after 20 years. So one of the core interests I have over this time, still maintain this interest, is can this thing called open science, open access, open knowledge, open scholarship, whatever you want to call it, disrupt, and this is the term that the group earlier in the presentation before me mentioned. Can these kind of practices disrupt the existing power structure that we see in global knowledge production? Can we see the kind of center-periphery relationship, north-south and relationship disrupted, so that we can see a more democratic, horizontal, equal type of knowledge production with equal or more equitable sharing of knowledge across regions and across institutions. I've been involved with running a platform, open access platform, since the early 1990s called Bioline International. Is one of the earliest open access platform. It was actually before the term open access was coined, and it was really the early days of the web. And we thought, oh, well, this thing called the web is really quite open with the technology and so forth. Why don't we just put journals on it and see what happened? And many of our colleagues from the developing world whose journals have been producing simply were not getting the circulations that they deserve. And we thought the internet would be a thing that allowed them to increase the visibility of the journals. So some of these journals that you see here are journals that we've been working with for over 20 years, some of them just celebrating the 20th anniversary this year, the African Health Sciences, the African Journal of Food and Nutrition and Development, for example. But these are journals that produce very, very important local research on food production, on local diseases and health issues that you don't see in Western journals, because they're deemed by Western journals to be not interesting enough or not important enough to be published. But also there's a bias against authors from the global South, from Africa, that, you know, somehow there's assumptions that their works are not good enough to be in the high impact journals. Now, incidentally, I want to plug a podcast that we'll be rolling out next week. So if you can take the URL and then you can follow this, then you will hear our interview with Dr. James Tuini, who's the editor-in-chief of this journal, African Health Sciences. One of the stories that Professor Tuini reminded me of was that over 20 years ago, when he was working as a doctor in Zimbabwe, and he wrote up a paper about his experience working with a local health group, and he submitted the journal to a UK-based journal. He submitted this article to this UK-based journal from where he was in Zimbabwe at the time, and the paper was rejected. A few months later, he moved to the UK to work with Oxfam, and he was staying in Oxford in an area. And on the street, he told me it was the street called Edinburgh Street. And then he decided to submit the paper again using that address, the exact same paper, but with a different address from the UK, and the same paper was accepted. The only difference of those two papers was the address. And so it was a stark reminder in terms of the kind of inequity that's built into the system that often make us question who is behind these system of knowledge production and why they do so. So my early assumptions about open science was open access was that, you know, these are the over 20 some odd years ago, we thought the network was flat, and that open access is the key to creating an equitable world of knowledge. So there was a lot of assumptions about how this could democratize knowledge production, create a kind of global knowledge commons and increase the flow of self-to-self knowledge and so forth. And that we can allow the kind of scaling because using open technologies is low cost and so forth. Fast forward 20 years, we are seeing that, of course, digital networks are far from being flat and equitable. Digital networks, in fact, replicate a lot of the existing power dynamics and hierarchies. And that infrastructures, because they are largely now owned by the corporate entities that have a very different motivation for building infrastructure, and so they are never really neutral in the way they're designed. They're designed for certain purposes that often do not meet the needs or the ideal of the scholarly communities. And of course, we're seeing the huge concentration of power. A small handful of multinational publishers now publish the majority of the world so-called high-ranking journals and materials. And so these same entities create governance bodies like the DOI Foundation, the Crossref, a lot of these so-called non-profit organizations that are the front for publishers that make up rules and standards and slogan, like many of those that we hear today about data sharing, fair data sharing, and all these things are really things to empower the publishers to make more researchers being compliant with the things that they like to see so that they can maximally extract the kind of open data, open resources that they can then turn into more high value products for themselves. So it is important that we understand how these infrastructures are built, who builds them, and how they continue to replicate existing power structures, a lot of which are still actually built on past historical racial and colonial practices based on what constitute superior knowledge over other forms of knowledge. And so in recent years, I have been in collaboration with many folks, as I said before, and these are some examples of collaborations I have had learning from many other scholars, including many early career researchers. The one on the left here, the contextualizing openness, was an outcome of a network project called Open and Collaborative Science and Development Network that actually officially finished a couple of years ago, but we continue to work on the data and work with the partners that we've been working with earlier on and continue to learn from their local experiences. I've been also fortunate to learn with some of the pioneer of community-based research, Professor Butthall, Professor Rajas Tandor, and then pioneer indigenous scholar Lorna Williams, Dr. Lorna Williams, who have been advocating for revitalization of indigenous language and integration of indigenous knowledge into the curriculum and as part of the higher education process. And of course, there's also Florence Piron, who has been very active with Open Science Network in West Africa and Haiti. And they have also brought with us a lot of lessons about the different ways we should think about openness. And so we should think about the many different intersection dimensional of openness, including beyond rather just thinking about publications and data, but what we understood as openness to society, and that is openness to the different members of society that also could take part in the knowledge production, knowledge making, and knowledge sharing process. And more importantly, we have to think about openness as being open to knowledges that have been historically excluded from the mainstream science, so-called. So this OCSD net that I mentioned really involved quite a number of partners from around the world, and many of these projects that they conducted locally tells us about how openness should not be taken as a universal concept. So our colleagues who work with indigenous people in South Africa reminded us that many indigenous people were subjected to a lot of colonial encounters of dispossession, and often these the actions of dispossessions are based on the notion of openness. So settler comes and say, well, these lands are not owned by anything. These are open for the taking. And so they would declare land that are there and provide, and then set up laws and regulations to exclude people who used to live there. So the notion of openness has been historically been problematic, and we have to remind ourselves that their openness is not somehow one meaning. In particular, a lot of indigenous communities reminded us that they also have their own community practices and protocols as to who they want to share their knowledge with. It's not that they don't want to share knowledge openly, but they would like to share it based on their own understanding of who you are, how they want the knowledge to be used, and so forth. So the respect for their rules, their protocols, their sovereignty is something that we have to be cognizant of. And so looking around the world, this is actually a common theme. Many communities don't want this kind of carte blanche ideas of openness imposed on them. They want also to be having a say in what they want to open, particularly for activists working in different parts of the world against government, against corporations. If they are too open about some of the work, they could actually be endangered. And so we need to think about whose ideas, whose knowledge, and how we could work together in a way that is both consensual, safe, and mutually beneficial at the same time. So a key understanding is that really open is not a solution, as many people would like to think, and that idea of openness is highly situated. And here I would refer back, as my previous group, to a lot of feminist scholars, feminist philosophers of science, whose writings about and questioning about Western science have laid a foundation for some of these understanding about why openness should be thought of as being situated, and that it is very contingent upon the researchers and the context, the history, and the privilege of the researchers themselves in relations to communities with whom they work. And so we need to be able to think about openness in this local context. Alexandra, can you hear me? How much time do I have?
I can hear you, Leslie. If you can wrap up in about 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions, that'd be fine. Okay,
so I was trying to finish. So one of the key output of the research network that we have is this set of principles, and you can go to the web and find out more. But one of the things that we argue for, as I said early on, is about questioning infrastructure. And that is, but by that we mean that we want the kind of tools and platforms and networks that are built by the communities and for the communities, with lots of inputs from the people who are using them. And for the purpose that they would like to use it for. And the reason we're advocating for this is that what we see, a lot of the tools and infrastructures that are being built are built by the powerful entities, the same powerful entities like Elsevier that publishes a lot of these journals, but they're also been acquiring a lot of the infrastructures to build these end-to-end system so that the researchers and the university are locked in from the beginning, from the time you submit your article to the processing of the data, to the publications, to the evaluation of the data, to the feeding of the data into university rankings that I said earlier. That these are the systems that are closed and built, but they are sold as products and services that can improve the visibilities of those who have the resources and, of course, privilege to use them. But this is an exclusive system that shuts out the majority of the world, and it creates a particular forms of legitimations and productions that really greatly reduce the diversity and understanding of science itself. So we need to understand these practices, embed within it, these infrastructure, embed within it certain kind of epistemological assumptions about what is true, universal, and objective, and ignore a whole many diversity of ways of doing and understanding the world through different means and different cosmologies and epistemologies. We privilege certain kind of epistemology when we privilege a certain kind of infrastructure, but unfortunately, a lot of these infrastructures, as I said, are invisible. So we are kind of trapped into that system. So so again, I want to finish by saying that we need to be thinking about who we're doing science with, and listen to our communities that we work with in terms of what it is that they would like to see happen, instead of coming in with our own agenda, perform the research on them, take the data and leave, and then publish it in the high-ranking journals and extract the benefit for our own career advancement and our university's publicity. So this is, I'm going to finish here, but I'm running out of time, but I want to highlight particular principle within the set of ideas that we put together in the manifesto, on this idea of the right to research. Something that, again, increasingly I think we should think about, that again, open research, open science is not about simply access. It's not simply about standards, but who has the ability and the right to take part in doing research. And Pandura here reminded us that around the world, people are knowledge makers everywhere, but it is important that we acknowledge a right to knowledge making and to knowledge sharing is a fundamental human rights as well. And finally, this is a little bit of a wild conjecture on my part, because I think we're all living in this thick of this pandemic, and doesn't look like we're out of it anytime soon. And of course, what is worrying that is unfolding in front of us is not simply the pandemic itself, but the way the vaccines are being rolled out, the kind of unequal distribution. Some people refer to as a vaccine apartheid or vaccine nationalism that we see, that really are not in a way surprising, because they just reveal the deep embedded systemic structural inequalities that we have in our world system. And if we continue to privilege science the way we have, some kind of singular truth, and science will get us out of this, or we can vaccinate our way out of this, I think we're going to be in even deeper trouble if we get there at all. If not, we're going to be finished by climate change before that. But I came across this article by two researchers from Australia, Baum and Friel. They've been talking about this idea of a social vaccine. By that they mean building the kind of social infrastructure that protects everybody. That is a life of security for everyone, and opportunities that are fair and equitable, and a planet that supports biodiversity, and of course, most importantly, governance for the people, by the people, that is just as well. And in my fantasy, I'm thinking about we should have some kind of social vaccine against knowledge enclosure. That is, we should have infrastructure that are designed and governed by people that is built on an assumption of a pluriversal view of science and knowledge around the world, and that people who want to take part has the right to do so, because it is their right to research. And this hopefully will help us transition from an extraction-based economy of knowledge production to more generative mode of knowledge production. I will end here. I'm sorry I went over time. And,
That's okay. It was really, really interesting. So I'm sure everyone's really enjoyed hearing your views on this. So unfortunately, we have run a bit into the break. We have a few questions in the Q&A. So Leslie can choose to answer them via chat. But we can also continue the conversation in the roundtable discussion. There's about an hour. But thank you so much once